Hello again, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about design thinking and applying it to systems. It's a virtual masterclass again, and this is quite a heavy topic to some extent. Maybe it also sounds a little bit boring because many people don't necessarily want to think about systems and systematizing things, but it's very, very powerful and important to businesses, especially. I myself actually studied business information systems at master's degree, so I feel a little bit of pressure talking about this because theoretically I should be some sort of an expert on this matter, but I don't feel like it whatsoever. So let's see how much value I can actually deliver in this talk, and also I'd really appreciate any questions or comments from you so that we can integrate it into this presentation, as well as going forward to do some more presentations with regards to design thinking applied to various other aspects of business. So I'll just crack on straight into this. I know like a bunch of people can't really make it tonight live. I think it's something to do with timing of 8 p.m. So in the future I might move these to 10 p.m. for better engagement and live. But obviously the session will be available on demand afterwards. So please feel free to also ask questions in the comments afterwards. I will be picking those up and responding to them, as well as integrating them going forward. The first thing to talk about is that there is a notion of systems thinking, which I sort of had to pick up a formal definition of from Wikipedia, and it says something like systems thinking is a management discipline about understanding of a system by examining linkages and interactions between its components. So this whole notion of systems thinking has existed for a long while, and design thinking builds on this and integrates system thinking as a part of the entire design thinking mindset. So this is why it's important to talk about systems in general, because system thinking is a very important aspect of design thinking, just like is business thinking and sort of creative thinking and so on. So I think one of the first things I want to talk about the notion of information architecture, and just generally the architecture of things as they exist. Mostly in sort of digital systems, we are architecting things like data, content, and the general structure of how things are organized. The structure of things is very important throughout any business, which in itself is a system. Business is a system. You can look at organization as a system of interacting components, okay? And what we spoke about at the beginning of like the introduction of this entire theme of design thinking for business, we look at business here as made up of 6 aspects, which is people, systems, innovation, products, money, and growth. And so I'm going around that sort of hexagon in a sort of anti-clockwise direction, and I've already spoken about people. Now I'm talking about systems. The next one's going to be on innovation, the next one on products, the next one on money, and the next one on growth. So we can sort of round off this circle and talk about how design thinking applies to all these areas, but also then subsequently go a little bit deeper into these areas and look at specifics. So the business in itself is a system made up of these 6 components, and it has its sort of information architecture, and information architecture is an incredibly important concept to apply to systems of any kind, especially digital systems. and we can architect data, we can architect content, and we can certainly look at structure of how things are made up, what components. Now, this componentized thinking is incredibly important aspect of systems thinking, and more we're able to break things down into its components or modules that make up the entire whole of a system, the better we'll have and both understanding and control over that system that we're creating. So, for example, I always remember when thinking about components, I always remember the advert for Audi cars that talks about the Audi has something like 12,000 patents on specific components that make its engine up. And each one of those components is specifically designed to make Audi drive in the way it drives. And it's very hard to replicate that because Audi has patents on each individual component, and so other manufacturers better design something different, or if they want to use Audi's components, then they can pay Audi for that privilege. So this ability to break things down into individual components is incredibly powerful. And within the practice of information architecture, we're always looking at which parts make up digital systems. Let's talk about digital systems here for the sake of an example. We can talk lots of different things as systems. But so, for example, in the case of websites or web apps or native apps and so on, we've got typically websites, you have headers, you have footers, you have an article section, you have the navigation section, and then you have individual components of content items that make up pages and feeds and so on. Within those components that are usually made up of smaller elements, and in HTML they're called elements, atomic units, atomic components are the ones that can't really be split up any further than what they are. So on web pages, things like buttons or a paragraph or a link or an image typically aren't really splittable further, so they're elements that are atomic units that make up then molecular structures and then more of materials and pages and so on. So this notion of atomic design is very, very powerful in terms of thinking of systems that make up digital experiences. So I've worked on a number of clients, for example, one being HSBC, where I've created these pattern libraries or component libraries that consistently enable teams of people to create pages and apps just by dragging and dropping these little building blocks of the overall system. So and because each pattern and each component is done in a standardized way, both in terms of look and feel and how it works, it enables very rapid creation of a system, both in terms of the way it looks as a wireframe, but also as a prototype, because you can create components that have functional abilities to them. So there's this notion of information architecture and the structure of the system, and very importantly, like I said, data, content, and the structure as itself. Data is this kind of usually quite broken down, structured atomic units of information. Content in general is much more broadly, loosely structured information. And structure in itself is just the sort of canvas, the context within which system operates. Okay, and so there's also the notion of a system as a process. So you might be thinking of like a sales system in businesses. There's a sales system of how you take somebody from being a cold prospect to being a repeat customer. There is a process there through which you're going to take that customer, and that process in itself is a system. It may be just constituted of physical activities that you do in terms of verbalizing and communicating with the customer. Might not involve any technological systems as such, but it's still a system because as a process it has a function of driving the customer through this funnel of conversion. Other systems that we typically find in businesses are like things like customer relationship management systems and content management systems, and there's the whole notion of workflow, how a workflow is enabled across teams, so that, for example, if someone's writing an article, there could be a workflow component around the first person that writes an article, posts it into the CMS, content management system, and then there is a workflow component to it that requires an editor to review the article and then publish it. That's kind of like a workflow type system. And so each system typically has a core purpose, and depending on how it's architected, information architected, it might have add-ons which are optional. So typically something like WordPress, which powers something like 41% of the internet. WordPress has the core purpose of publishing pages, blog, right, or website pages, but then it has all sorts of add-ons that you can include, and they extend the capability of the system without disrupting the core purpose. And then, so what we end up finding is that because businesses typically have lots of different systems, and you'll find this even if you're running your own small business, you quickly end up having to use email, and you have to use all sorts of social media marketing tools, and like I'm using here, the broadcasting tools from Facebook in this case, but there's millions of them, not there's a choice. So there's core purpose to a system, and then there is add-ons, and the architecture of a system enables this to work. And sort of in design thinking, we're always very cognizant of the fact that as systems become more and more complex, they can lose their core purpose, and therefore it can become very tricky to communicate what they're about, how they work, and maintain them and design them further, and so on. Right now, what's happening, for example, with Uber, is that Uber was a very, very high user experience app when it first started, because it was basically about summoning a cab that you then take to a place. But now Uber's rolling in Uber Eats, and there's another Uber thing where they've layered another element of the experience on top of their app system, and it's starting to confuse people because it's kind of losing some of its core purpose. And these are the kind of risks that companies often run into when they're adding on more and more stuff into their overall company system and business system. So the core purpose is very, very important. Then even there are, within systems, there are notions of protocols, which is like the language, the structured language and messaging, which enables communication between different systems. So, for example, typically you might find that if you have your mailing list for whatever reason in some sort of spreadsheet, you might want to import that spreadsheet into some sort of mailing software, and that software needs to be able to accept that spreadsheet as an input. The protocol that runs between these two is what enables that integration. nowadays with online systems, we have APIs, application programming interfaces, which are effectively protocols, and this is where a lot of confusion arises because uh, designers and architects don't necessarily know how to best do this in terms of designing APIs. So a lot of APIs are not that usable, which makes them suffer from sort of a low uptake. Um, and so APIs enable the communication between different systems, because what we've ended up in this world in, when the internet first came about, it was like, well, no one was online. Then suddenly everyone was online, and then every company was building their own system. And then we realized, oh, these systems don't talk to each other, so we better start building some sort of protocols that enable them to link up. And then there's so many protocols as well, and so it's just like the whole thing is incredibly complicated. But that's also why it requires careful design, so that it takes into account all these complexities and requirements across different components within the business. And so when we have this notion of multiple systems running across in the company, or often the time companies will be building systems as a product. So, company that's selling laptops or iPhones or smartphones and so on. Those are systems really that they're selling. They'll then create other products that need to work, other system products that need to work with the previous product. So if you bought a smartphone from Apple, you would expect it to work nicely with a smartwatch from Apple. So you've got two systems there that you're using, but they need to work together, and that then builds an ecosystem. So my friend Kevin here in the group, he is actually an ecosystem designer, but in this case he's an ecosystem for proper ecosystems made up of plants and potentially animals. But in this case, we're talking about ecosystems or technological systems, right? How does one product work with another product, with another product, with another product? At Rowley, I worked on an ecosystem design where there was a component of hardware music instruments, software music instruments, and the cloud social network that all have to work together to provide this ecosystem for music making. Very complicated and requires a lot of protocols that enable communication to and from, but that's where the power of ecosystem design and thinking and structure and architecture really reflects itself. And so it's no wonder that Rowley is now selling in Apple stores worldwide as the leading music making product. Because it's had so many of these components and systems integrated into itself and really well designed from lots of different aspects. So where things become really interesting and tricky is where we start having systems that are made up of people. And typically these are organization structures and architectures. So corporations have gone from very, very highly hierarchical 32-layer pyramidal structure to much flatter sort of 7-layer structures, to now moving towards flat structure called holacracy, where there are no real managers, kind of everyone's potentially a manager, and teams emerge rapidly and dismantle themselves quite rapidly depending on what needs to be done. So it is somewhat, to me, obvious that when systems are made up of people, these are no longer mechanical components that have sort of logical flow to them. People are predictably irrational, so people systems are very tricky to design in an effective way. And management science has battled with this for a long time and keeps battling with it, and design thinking is certainly coming in to offer its own angle on this. taking into account more the emotional aspects of human beings, and not so being driven by logical drivers, thinking, that people make logical decisions all the time, which they don't. For most part, 95% of decisions are emotionally, subconsciously driven. So with design thinking, at least theoretically, we should be able to design better people systems, because we'll take into account the human psychology in a more holistic way than what typically management science has done so far, where they've applied the engineering and this crude mechanical system thinking to people as well. So within systems, we still have logic and conditional logic, certainly in the kind of technological system. In people systems, that logic and conditional logic may not apply so much and so well. So having some sort of more flexible approach that's driven by more guidelines and general best practices versus strict rules is likely to be a better approach to managing a corporation than setting up strict rules, roles, structures, components, process flows, and so on, because that prevents the organization from being able to adjust its way of working in a more rapid way. So if you think about it's a difference between like a dinosaur with its one head and a huge body, and like a shoal of fish, where the fish can quickly and rapidly change direction, and they're one singular units of a bigger whole. So systems that we typically find inside businesses, like content management systems, CRM, email, analytics that help with decision making, or theoretically help with decision making, communication tools such as Slack, and soon we're going to have Facebook for Work, Workplace, database management systems for storing data and then doing some data analysis on top of, potentially the payment systems. You've got accounting, you've got social media and promotion stuff, you've got customer support systems, stock control if you're selling physical goods, various broadcasting and marketing systems. So before you even know, you've got systems for managing people, systems for building systems and processes around that, and for management and maintenance. You've got innovation processes, you've got products which may be systems in themselves, and a system for building products, okay? And then you've got the money systems, so accounting and payments and repayments and subscription. And then you've got growth systems, which is marketing and sales and so on. So really, systems run throughout the whole business, and the business itself is one giant system where you have to really think as to how this thing is really going to work. Now, that's why I studied business information systems, because really, this is the core aspect of every business. And as we go more and more into the future, it becomes more and more relevant. And so we are actually now moving towards a virtual world where virtual reality plays a huge part in everything. And as more and more things become automated inside businesses, we can create more and more of these virtual companies, which is what I studied in 2003. My master's degree thesis was on managing virtual teams in completely virtual environments. So I was looking at concepts of how to work with people that you've never met before and create things within a business that make sense, that are innovative, great products that make money and that can grow. Okay. in 2003, so 13 years ago. We still live today in in a world where most companies want most people to come to work 9 to 5 and work in an environment where the air conditioning isn't correctly set up, where they're forced to look at a screen and not really communicate with other people. Why? Because it's kind of just culturally not appropriate to do so, or if you ask a question, you'll suddenly realize there's lots of problems and it goes into a conversation which has no end, and so on. So, um, business information systems more and more important, and they run across the full gamut of the business, and the business itself is a system. Uh, and there's going to be more and more of this. So, knowing how to work with systems, design them, comprehend them, analyze them, improve them is an incredibly highly important skill, and will be more and more important skill. We're also moving towards completely automated companies, which are called autonomous companies, where everything's automated and theoretically no people work in these companies. So then there is a big question as to what happens to the overall world economy, in which every company is completely automated and don't need people to work at them, so people won't have jobs, and this gives rise to universal minimum income and so on. Interesting topic. Not part of this, but it's a point of how systems are changing everything in our lives. And then also, even further to that, systems are becoming integral part of us, humans. If you look up a movement called Humanity Plus, it's really about modding our bodies with technology to give us superpowers that we don't have. So people are talking about creating skins that are bulletproof, or being able to change your skin so that it looks different. So if you want to go to a fancy dress party, you can actually change your skin, or giving yourself augmented intelligence to be able to quickly think up new things or look up Wikipedia without having to actually take out any machines and so on. And really, in many respects, our mobile phones are already very close to our bodies anyway. They're just not part of our bodies, but we feel lost if we don't have our mobile phone for 2-3 minutes on us. So systems are likely there to stay, and they're integral part of design thinking, and they're the enablers often of making other things. So for example, without this system of Facebook Live right now, it would be much trickier for me to spread this message and design thinking talks that I'm doing to large group of people, because I just wouldn't have that reach and possibility to do that. If you guys have any questions, please pop them in now. Now is a good time, because I'm coming to more or less an end of this overview of design thinking and applying it to systems and businesses. What would be also interesting for me to hear is like what sort of systems you might be using in your businesses, what you're wondering about. I know Frank has asked in the past, like more about how, like, so best practices to designing websites and so on. Websites in themselves are often a system for publishing pages and content and so on. And what we find, like when I first started, for example, building websites, and this is very important, I think, to share. Like in the past, when the web first started coming out, companies were thinking like, what's the point of having a website when no one's online? And it was good question. But then it was possible to put up a page like a brochureware, so a simple static page that described, okay, this company sells housing sells houses, and so if you want to buy or sell a house, come into our branch and we will enable you to do that. So that's cool, but then it's like, well, what's the point of that when, no one's looking at it, or even if they're looking at it, they can't actually do anything with that brochureware. So then we started thinking, like, okay, what else is the next thing to enable the customers to do? So people could call or fill in a form and send some sort of request. Then that moved into like being able to actually apply for renting a place online, which is Airbnb. Uh, so so systems like this became kind of more integrated and giving customers like deeper ability um, to execute practical tasks without ever doing anything physical. And so the whole banking system is going through massive transformation where they're realizing that people don't really need to go to branches anymore, so everything should be online. But then how should that system be designed and created so as to give even more value to the customers compared to the branches where you could actually still speak to some sort of human being. Uh, so in UK we have a startup called Monzo, which is an app, so a smart bank, which um, they're promoting this idea of like it's a smart bank that helps you monitor your spending and income so that you can work with your money in a smarter way. So systems are becoming much smarter. And I forgot to say that with artificial intelligence and proliferation of artificial intelligence, what that is enabling us is to codify the logic and the conditionals into our sort of decision making across the business to then automate and enable faster and bigger throughput of processing decisions, leverage to run a bigger and better business and potentially at a smaller cost. Uh, and then with design thinking, there's always a question of how to design the simplest system to to have the highest impact and value add to the end customer. Lots of big corporations have come to a point where they are so struck down with complexity of their internal systems that people have got really lost and they don't like to use them anymore. So there is a whole notion of the experience of each system and how usable it is, how it integrates across into the ecosystem of the company. And this is what design thinkers battle with all the time. And also what happens with systems is that over time they become legacy systems and they're too old, they need to be changed. So then it's a question of like, as one system within the ecosystem or components of certain systems become too old for their purpose, there is a need to redesign those components into what is now required from customers. And that in itself is a huge challenge, both from architectural perspective, operational perspective, user experience perspective, financial perspective, planning perspective, all that stuff. So systems are integral part of any company, and companies get designed all the time. Designers deal with systems, design systems, often designing systems that build other systems and so on. So it's a very kind of meta topic in some respects, but there is method to the madness to at least some extent. And I think more systematically you can think in any of these areas, the better you will be in your overall understanding of things and being able to make better decisions. Just bear in mind that people systems are often very, very different to mechanical systems. Let me read a comment from Andy. Thanks, Andy, for posting this. So he says, "Hey, Jason, I work mostly with startups that are creating or have created a product, typically a web app or a mobile app. Often they don't have a system in place, so I will I try to help them with this. Typically, I end up helping them with UX and UI design, but also how they work and collaborate. I'm keen to move towards being able to incorporate design thinking with my clients, interested to know how you integrate this with any startups you work with. Is it a mixture of lean, agile, and design thinking, or something completely different? Okay, so this is a very good question. I'd say that in design thinking, the whole lean approach is just baked into design thinking, because with design thinking, we're always looking to get the quickest possible understanding of what we need to do at the minimal cost. Okay, so especially to get consensus within business as to what ought to be done and what the best solution is. So if that means just sketching something on paper for 5 minutes, that's potentially enough design to make something defined enough to move it into an actual creation that can benefit a customer. So I think there's this big misconception that somehow design thinking is a slow process. Design thinking is a slow process versus lean startup being a fast process. I don't think that's correct. I think design thinking is lean, but also much more correct because it looks at a more holistic picture of a business, so specifically covering all these aspects: people, systems, innovation, products, money, and growth, and understands that we can't just be hacking on the systems without bearing in mind all these other aspects. And in many respects, you like lean and agile is a form of design thinking, really. And so I just say, like, for startups, I know startups is often like cash strapped. So in design thinking, like, we're always just looking to do things with the resources that we have available. If I propose building a gold-plated house, if I'm an architect, and there is no budget for gold plating, there's no gold available, that's irrelevant design. I have to work within the budgetary constraints. And with design thinking, the idea here is that design thinking will give you the best bang for the buck, no matter how much bucks you've got. If you've got $0, you then realize that actually ultimate creativity and creation comes out of nothingness. Okay, the stars in the universe are born out of the vacuum, out of the ether, which is seen by scientists as nothing, empty space. So then in design thinking, you'll say, like, okay, if we have no money, how do we create something that's valuable to the customer? What ingredients do we use? And that's the ultimate entrepreneurial question. And if there isn't really an easy answer to that, then probably the conclusion is that what the business is trying to do isn't really that valuable to any customers, or they certainly can't find people who would find that valuable. So, for example, there is no reason why a startup that has no product, no system, not even people or anything like that, why a startup can't be asking people for an email in return for a promise of what they're going to do. Just that, like, conceptual idea has theoretically enough value to earn an email address. Now, when you got tens of thousands of people signing up for a designed proposition, okay, then you can go to investors and say, we've got 10,000 people who are theoretically willing to maybe even pay, £10 for this thing. I want £10,000 to enable to build the next version of this system that will enable me to cash in on the £100,000 10 pounds times 10,000 is 100,000. So you're creating a value of tenfold just by putting up a page that asks people for an email address so that you can follow up with them and say, hey, we've went from a proposition that said for £10 we will sell you this. Now we've raised, off the back of that, we raised £10,000, and with that £10,000 we're creating another thing that is good enough to ask you for that £10, so we can raise the 100,000 and then use that money to leverage into the next version of the system that will serve more customers and create a better product and bigger value. So this really, really links up with the systems thinking and the notion of the initial system is going to be small and primitive and low capacity. But as designers, we have to think about how things will evolve. There is no such thing as revolution. Every revolution happens through a series of evolutionary steps. And so at Rowley, we used to call this revolution through evolution. And so that's how it works. So lean and agile and design thinking go hand in hand together, because design thinking is always, designers have always thought this way. Lean and agile just kind of made it more explicit, really. And to some extent, I think what in lean and agile is often discarded is the bigger picture, the vision, the aims and objectives and so on. So which design thinking actively addresses and says, okay, this is the big picture that we're looking to this is the big picture that we're looking to aim towards, and then we're going to use these iterative steps to build up to that big picture. And yes, in the end we might end up in a slightly different area, but at least we were aiming towards a big picture. So Andy is saying, okay, great, thank you, Jason, that makes sense, and it's how I think of it. I've seen people wanting to separate these things, which is why I asked. I think it's part of a more holistic approach, and yes, the problem I often find is the limited budget, which is why I try to encourage using less to create more value in less time. Something I see happening is a lack of thinking about how quick wins might affect other areas of the business or the product. Yeah, so this is the idea of how to design for now, but and I think like this is where in agile and lean, right, this is the key thing. In agile and lean, I think the way I've understood this all the time is that agile is like build something, build, measure, learn, right? That build, measure, learn process is an important thing. Usually build means build out of code, right, or something tangible. And so although I've recently went to a conference where a guy was talking about agile and lean and said build, measure, learn, and I said, why would you build something when you could just test its validity with a simple prototype? And said, oh, by building I meant prototype or a sketch as well. That classifies as build. It's like, okay, well then that's design thinking. So many startups fall into this trap, and this kind of somewhat antithesis to the theme of this conversation, which is that although systems are integral to making businesses work, they're not necessarily the first thing that you should be building. You should be building a better understanding of your holistic proposition and how that might work, so that once you start building in the systems, which are much more tangible and hard and logical and procedural, once you start actually codifying that, you're not codifying it based on a whole bunch of assumptions, but you're codifying it based on more universal understanding of both your customers and humans in general. And so I think the human-centered design is a very highly important and leverageable aspect of all of this, to say, well, look, for example, each business deals with people, so we better have a very solid system for hosting people information, right? and being able to leverage that people information into the rest of the business processes. So those things need to be very solid, and you'll be amazed at how many businesses don't have this one unified customer database, right? So, and this happens often when businesses acquire other businesses. So if, let's say, Salesforce buys some startup, the startup has 100,000 users, but how does Salesforce merge that startup's users and customers into the Salesforce customer base? This is not an easy thing necessarily to do, because some of those customers will be same people, and so on. So famously, like at Bupa, Bupa acquired dental insurance business, which was a separate company, and what that meant was that the dental insurance customers were separate business, separate database, separate system. And then when people were calling Bupa for health insurance, they, like Bupa health insurance salespeople, would say, which is growth, they would say, "Oh, okay, so you're getting this health insurance. Would you also like dental insurance with that?" And the guy would say, "I already have dental insurance with Bupa. Why are you asking me that question?" Because the customer is not aware that these systems are not integrated. And they'll go, "Oh, okay, no, never mind. But at that point, the customer would potentially lose trust in Bupa as a brand, because they're thinking, how come they don't know that I'm a customer? They don't understand that these are two separate businesses internally, and they haven't been integrated well. And also it means that it's harder for Bupa to cross-sell from dental insurance to full health insurance and integrate these products and the growth process all together. So, and then with designers always looking for the quickest win at any point in time that's most value adding to the customer, and also potentially easiest to do. It's just that most of the time in most businesses there isn't really such a simple thing to do that's going to give loads and loads of value. It requires much more work for companies to actually realize bigger value. And so yesterday we actually, while we're on this theme, and I mentioned ecosystem thinking and so on. Yesterday we went to a presentation by European head of Tesla Motors, and he spoke at UCL. And if you think of Tesla as a company, there is 3 or 4 companies there that are actually working together to make the whole proposition of Tesla and everything else work together. So this is the level at which the biggest business minds in the world are thinking at. They've set up separate companies. Like Tesla is what I think of Tesla as a connected transportation grid. Okay, that's how I think of Tesla, not as a car company. Car is just a product with a small p. The big system of Tesla is the connected transportation grid. Then there's the solar city that's providing the batteries and the solar power and so on. And so Elon Musk is thinking, if people have solar panels on their roofs, they can charge their Teslas at home at no cost going forward. These are all systems. Then SpaceX puts up satellites into the orbit that connect all these cars that are self-powered by renewable energy at home. And Tesla and Solar City, which is all Elon Musk properties, are all benefiting from that, because he's creating a grid of ecosystem technological grid around the world that enables all these things that humans ultimately need. And so they think, at Tesla, they think from first principles, which is actually that kind of atomic approach, going from like, what's the basic truth that we understand and know, and then we build up from there what has to be to work out the most optimal way in which to realize ideas. So he spoke about how they used first principles thinking to work out how many calls their salespeople needed to make optimally to grow the business the most. And he spoke about how if people made 100 calls, that wasn't necessarily the best thing, because the quality of the calls would drop, because it would have to be like a 2-minute call for every call. If they made something like 20 calls, that's not enough, not best use of time. And then so somewhere in the 50 call range is best kind of balance between quality and call numbers and conversions. Hi Klaus, nice to see you join as well. So yeah, Tesla is building this, and Tesla and Solar City and SpaceX are building this giant ecosystem. So it's systems of companies, and this is the level at which like big thinkers in business and design thinking, how they're looking at things in longer term. And it's not even really a longer term, because Tesla's only been around for relatively short period of time, and it's already really disrupting one of the least disruptable, seemingly least disruptable industries in the world. So the power of design thinking applied across all these things is enormous. And I asked the question, to what extent is design thinking important at Tesla? And the answer was that right now Elon Musk only thinks about 3 products internally, like the self-driving autonomous software, the next Model S, whatever it is, and another product thing. And he said explicitly, I don't want to talk about anything else other than those 3 effectively systems. And because he doesn't have capacity to talk about more things and kind of waste his mental energy on that. These are his top 3 priorities. So I think that the chap who's heading Tesla in Europe was saying design thinking is incredibly important at Tesla, to the point where it's like no other conversations will be had with Elon Musk other than stuff to do with that. If you guys have any other questions for this, I'm going to start wrapping up, and thank you all for listening in. And for the ones who are watching on the demand, please also ask questions. Just one more quick announcement. On 23rd of November, we're running a very important design thinking meetup at Mother London in Shoreditch. There's an event in this group that you can sign up to. Also, I'm going to post a comment with a link here, so it would be great to see you physically on 23rd of November and talk about design thinking applied to storytelling. So thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.